Fiona, could you tell us what your role is at JCRT? And we have got some information up on the board there, and anything you want to add about what JCRT does. Sorry, JCCT.
Yeah.
I'm getting the wrong acronym.
Similar but different.
Yeah.
So my role at the Trust is to lead the whole charity, actually. So I'm called the Executive Director. And that does say what we do. I will probably, as we go through a little bit more about the roles that we have and the services that we offer. But that does summarise who we are. Do you want me to go through that now, or?
No,
Okay.
unless you want to.
Absolutely not.
So we've in the interest of time, we only
Perfect.
have an hour, so we're aiming to finish at 4:30. So we'll try and get through our questions as best we can. And if there's any left over, we might ask you to answer those in writing at the end.
Yeah,
That's
perfect.
Okay. So how many families do you support annually? With your
Around
services?
160 a year.
160 a year. And how do families find out about your services?
So the variety of services have different ways. We're a universal service in some respects. So a quick Google search, we're top of Google for information, for childcare information, down to more specialised services where there's a variety of professionals that refer families to us.
Yeah.
But also families can refer themselves as well to certain services.
Okay. And in terms of the main issues that the families are facing, what would those be?
So it does depend which programme, but if I could summarise into two categories, that would be families that are living in poverty and families who have children with special educational needs and or disabilities.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And obviously we're here to talk about the family-friendly amendments that were made to the employment law. There are two broad groups of changes in 2018, 2020 that we've put up there just to help summarise.
Yeah.
Did your service have to respond to those changes in any way and do anything differently? And if so, what did you have to do?
Well, we're an employer of over 25, mainly females. So we, as an employer, had to make sure that what our employment practices were meeting the requirements of the law. We exceed them, but we always keep abreast of what the changes are. In terms of families, we have seen a pattern of change for families seeking childcare later. So babies starting in nurseries a little bit older than perhaps they were before the changes. So from a service perspective, we may well have, if we were supporting a young child, it's rare, but it has happened where a child might need our support to be in a nursery from a young age. That could have been from 6 months old, and that's definitely got older in terms of the pattern of families that need support.
Is there an average for now when children are starting nursery, or is that impossible to say?
I think if you ask the nurseries, they give you the average. From what I've picked up from visits, it's not before 9 months. 9 to 12 months is what I've experienced as I go on a visit.
Okay.
It may well be different if you ask Jersey Early Years Association. They may have a much more informed view.
Thank you. Okay. And are there any services that you would like to provide to families but can't due to funding or resource issues? I'm sure that might be a how long is a piece of string question.
Come back to it if you'd like to come back to it.
Just give me a second to have a little think, because there are gaps in the island, and we have a vision as a charity actually at the moment that so we fund children's nursery places for 2 to 3 year olds who are living in poverty and have a developmental delay. So they've got that double whammy of challenge. And in July last year, 10 children that we had on our programme, we could fund them, we couldn't find them a nursery place. And so they missed out on that critical period of support, not because we didn't have the money, but because we couldn't find facilities for them. And so the Minister for Education found out, we'd reported this situation, and between SIPES and us, we've managed to open a new nursery on a school site at Doverne School in a community room, which is very self-sufficient. It's got its own facilities, all self-contained. and we've got 16 2 to 3 year olds in that nursery that we are we are employing the people to work in that nursery, and 16 families are benefiting. The Minister provides us with that space for that to happen. If we had unlimited funds, we would like to see more of that happen at the moment for children who have got additional needs, because the impact for each of those children is absolutely astounding in terms of their development. Children who had no language whatsoever, and they started in October. It took us 6 weeks to get the nursery up and running. But starting in October with no language and very difficult dysregulated behaviours, are now smiling, happy, communicating, using words, linking words together, being able to communicate what they want, and really getting a really good experience in that nursery. And if we think back to the 10 that missed out, who were in a similar position, the difficulty that they will have now starting Nursery Education Fund year and going on to school will be tremendous. So yeah, if we had all the money in the world,
Yeah.
we'd be helping to open more of them.
And was the challenge around staffing in nurseries or space in nurseries?
So our challenge was around funding, because we haven't got infinite funding, and we literally raise enough money each year to help children to access nurseries with disabilities and to access through our 2 to 3 year old programme. But there weren't enough nursery places for them.
So just, it was places generally, full stop. There wasn't space
just
for
one
those
spaces.
children. Okay.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Just in terms of, if I could, Chair, just as a little bit of a follow-up to that question, for those 10 children that missed out, what would you now look to do in terms of any support that you could give those children, and where might you look for that support?
So those children, our programme helps children for 2 to 3 year olds for that specific one. So from there on, they've moved on to the Nursery Education Fund. So they've got 30 hours nursery funded by government. They will be getting, hopefully, the support that they need from the nursery staff, who will make referrals for whatever therapeutic services or interventions that they need. But that goes on to the setting that they're now in.
Yeah, so it's
to make
a case
that
of
happen.
catch-up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of, I'm just going to come back to the maternity leave experiences, parental leave experiences that people have, and the people that you come into contact with. Is it your view that people are generally aware of their rights and responsibilities under Jersey's employment law? And do you know where they go to get this information, and if there's any gaps that you see in their understanding?
So I had that question in advance of today, and I've simply put, I don't know. Because we come into contact with parents when they're choosing childcare. So usually either after, that's one of the glimpses of insight I can give you, is that parents tell us that they've left choosing childcare too late. They didn't realise that they needed to look sooner rather than later, and have had difficulties making choices. But in terms of maternity and paternity and parental leave, we haven't asked parents that, because we see parents a little bit later on in terms of childcare.
Yeah. In terms of your own personal experience with people that you talk to on a general level, do you pick anything up around that particular area at all?
Not at all.
No?
We just don't have those conversations.
Okay. When people are trying to access or navigate parental leave, do you know whether there are any particular common challenges that people may well have experienced that they will talk to you about?
So our role, it doesn't really encourage that kind of conversation, but the insight that I would have would be around the families that we're supporting. There is a real lack of access to flexible working in any shape or form. A lot of the parents that we're supporting are working in very low paid jobs, often in 0-hour contracts, often playing tag team with each other. So in the care industry, for example, a mum and a dad would be one doing a night shift, and then one might work part-time, but, you know, a 24-hour period could be a 12-hour night shift for one and a 12-hour day shift for the other, and the night shift is then caring for their child in the day. We've seen that quite a lot, actually, in terms of the families that so when we have a panel meeting, say for 3 panel meetings a year for our nursery funding programme for 2 to 3 year olds, I would guess probably 20 to 30 families come through to each panel, and we've seen an increase from 3 or 4 parents in those circumstances going up now in terms of an increase in the number of parents that are working but still living in poverty, and then working in very difficult circumstances, playing that tag team round.
Okay, and in terms of some of the impacts of that, do you get to understand what the impacts of that situation is?
So I can talk personally about visits that I've made to, say, Play and Learn, for example, that nursery at Doverne, and a grandmother who is also part of the care team for her grandchildren, and the insight that she gave, and I hadn't asked much, I'd literally commented that must be hard when she said, oh, I've been working tonight, and she broke down straight away, and I thought, gosh, I hadn't pushed anything. It was a very kind of in a nursery, we were just chatting, and I thought very easily that grandmother broke down, and the pressure that they're under as a family to keep children healthy, safe and happy, and keep earning around that. And that was for all 3 of them. Mum, dad and grandmother were sort of juggling shifts to make it work.
Thank you.
So obviously people are coming to you for advice about childcare, but if they're coming to you before that age 2, when they're still covered by the leave, so obviously each parent can take up to 52 weeks. So in theory, each child who has 2 parents could have 2 years at home. But you say that parents are coming to you around 9 months, 12 months. What can you tell us about how this law is working and how that interacts with your services?
Well, we know that it's not a real option for many of the families that we're supporting to stay off for 52 weeks because there's only 6 weeks pay. I'm asking you that question because I wanted to refer you to a report produced by the ISOS partnership, and I can leave it with you, and it's Messages for Jersey from the UK and international evidence on optimising early childhood education and childcare. I wanted to refer you to that today because there's some evidence in here that I think would be really useful and to inform what you're looking at. But in it, there's an error. So it was just to highlight that this one says we have 32 weeks of paid parental leave, which obviously we don't. And I've highlighted it with policy officers, and they're going to be communicating with CLS and changing the version that you have on the website. But I still think this is a very useful document. That wasn't the point they were talking about. So it's the real choice.
Should we just reflect on these? So it's the 6 weeks full pay, which the employer is required to provide, and then there's 18 weeks per parent of social security pay, which is I think £280 a week or £281 a week, and that can be transferred. So, for example, the mother can take the 32 weeks, or the father can take a mixture. So this is why we have questions about it.
So I used Jack's website to make sure that I was clear today. And there's a video on there which talks about how much pay you have, which is 6 weeks. I then Googled it through AI as well, and it came up with 6 weeks. I then spoke to the policy officer about the 32 weeks. I was like, I can't understand. It's saying, everywhere it's 6 weeks. So I'm confused. And I'm a professional with a master's in this area.
You're not alone. And this is why we have some questions about the communication of this law, because some of the submissions that we've had so far have told us that people don't understand what is actually in the law. And so that perfectly illustrates that, and you're not alone. And there is a more detailed reckoner there, which I don't think we've actually got the amounts of pay on there, but here we go. It's on the other side. Yeah, so there's a lump sum, the tax-free lump sum, which is the parental grant.
Yeah.
There's the parental allowance, which is the 32 weeks. That comes after the 6 weeks at full pay. But so now we have that shared understanding.
Yes.
How does that interact with your services? And, before that 2 years that is provided in the law, what are people wanting in terms of childcare versus staying at home and using their leave?
Oh, well, there's a real mix, actually. A bit like there's no one childcare solution for everyone. It's a real mix of different views from families that we pick up. So some would like to remain at home for 2 years with their children. Others would like to return to work earlier, citing pressures around housing costs and living costs. It's a real mix.
Okay. And in terms of this legislation, how is this influencing parents' their decisions around when to return to work? So are people returning to work sooner than they'd ideally like to?
The bit that I was thinking about around the pay that a parent would receive is, does that really enable choice for families to remain off with their children? I think it's too low for parents to be able to afford that unless they've managed to save quite considerably before taking that time.
Do you think it enables choice?
I don't think so at the moment, not on that rate, not with the... No.
Yeah. And in terms of... Sorry, I'm just rephrasing some of my questions because you've already answered some of them. In terms of different types of parents, do you observe any patterns in different types of family setups?
Patterns in terms of...
In terms of
taking
how they're using the law or how they're aware of the law, perhaps?
I don't know if I'm informed enough to know. I don't think I've spoken to parents enough to know that.
Okay. Maybe let's think about single parents. Do you get contacts from single parents, and do you notice any patterns there and what they're saying to you?
The only contact that I could think of, specifically around single parents, would be the referrals into our panel for our nursery funding programme. So that's for the 2 to 3 year olds. But in terms of patterns around maternity and paternity, parental leave.
Okay. No. Thank you. So when parents have come to you for advice and then they're maybe accessing childcare based on your advice, do you have any follow-up, or are you able to see what happened following your advice and whether parents are happy with the kind of services they've accessed?
So it's information we give. We can't give advice on childcare. So it's simply sharing information around what their choices are. So they've got lots of different options around childminders, nannies, nurseries, etc. And we can help them tailor their choices based on their finances or their situation.
Okay.
But in terms of follow-up, no, it's very much... A lot of it now is on our website, less in terms of face-to-face and less on the phone, actually.
Yeah.
Over the years.
So if somebody had contacted you for advice but then ultimately decided not to access the childcare options, would you know about that?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. In those conversations about childcare at that point, am I right to assume that you might hear some feedback about going back to work, because the two usually coincide with each other? And I just wonder if there's any patterns that you might see come through about how people are going back to work. Are they that transition back in? Are they finding it easy? Do they need a bit more support? Or
again, because we've kind of moved more onto the internet, the website, we don't have that. No, because as you're talking, I'm recalling instances of sort of when we were based at the Bridge, so 10 years ago, 10 to 5 years ago, I could have called on a lot more, but the patterns have changed now with parents, and it's very much more online.
So you see people, that's where people are accessing their information.
Yeah.
They go online.
Yeah.
And do people pick up the phone anymore, or?
Rarely.
Okay.
Yeah, for us, rarely. A call or two a day.
Yeah. Social media and things like that as well, or is it?
Not from our information on social media, but I think that is something that we're thinking about going forward, actually, in terms of how we communicate with families, because Reels and TikTok and things are the way that people are absorbing information, and parents obviously will need that information in different ways. So that is something we're thinking about.
Yeah, I suppose it's that thing about accessing the information at a time that suits you as well. It's usually when you've sat down at home, in my case, you know, you've got an opportunity in an evening or whatever.
Exactly.
So, fair enough. You mentioned earlier about flexible working and actually seeing some challenges around that. Could you maybe go into that a little bit more?
So the families, particularly on our Best Start Plus nursery funding programme, so the 2 to 3 year olds living in poverty and with developmental delay, there are some patterns there around families who are working for employers where they can't offer them that flexibility, or it's more difficult to. So the care industry, for example. And so it's more often the case that we see families that have no option for flexible working, certainly, and then things like, you know, holidays, they're on 0 hours contracts and the holidays are rolled up into their pay, and so they don't take holidays, they continue working through. So there's certainly some increased pressures on the lower earners that we've seen as parents.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Fiona. You've provided some feedback that suggests that babies are joining nurseries later than before the legislation was introduced. Does this, in your view, indicate that parents are taking fuller advantage of leave entitlements or not? And how do you think that a reduction in the demand for the infant places may be impacting on those nurseries?
2 things in one question. You see, I have to write notes. Okay, so I think that the parents that are accessing nurseries because they can afford, or are managing to some way afford to pay for nursery. I'm not saying it's affordable, but they are managing to book that service. They're in a different situation to those that are on a lower income, and they will have perhaps more choices available to them to decide whether they would like to start in a nursery and when they would like to start. And so it could suggest that those parents have more opportunities to take more time in their maternity parental leave. The impact on nurseries, I think the business model is having to change and shift, and that they are taking babies who are slightly older onwards. This report actually is a useful one, the ISOS report, because it's basically a collection of the best evidence, and that indicates actually that's not a bad thing that children are in nursery. It's not a bad thing that children aren't in nursery at 6 months. It should be something that we should be aspiring for, children to be starting nursery later, so that they have that opportunity, particularly in the first 12 months, to bond with their caregivers, so their parents, usually, or their carers. And so when you have that really good, secure bonding and attachment with your parents or your carers, your main carers, then you're in a much better position to explore the world in a much more confident and happy, healthy way. So it's not a bad thing. It's for the nurseries a change, and then adapting to something different, having older babies. It's more challenging inducting a baby at 12 months rather than 6 months. Horrendous as a parent. It's really hard because the baby is so attached to the parent, which is why it is so important in our nurseries that we have a very low turnover of staff, so that when the child does move into a nursery, that the attachment with the secondary caregiver is just as good. And so when we're looking at quality of nurseries and quality of care, a high staff turnover indicates quite easily that that's not a good quality setting.
So could I just explore this a little bit? So you've talked about the importance of choice.
Yeah.
And one of those choices is that parents may choose to actually bring their child along to nursery education later. But therein lies a dilemma, in the sense that period, even though you say the evidence suggests that there's no detriment, as it were, but that maybe suggests that the legislation is actually supporting parents to make that choice. Would you agree with that?
I'm confused what you're saying about the detriment. Detriment to...
So in terms of, I don't mean detriment to nursery education. I mean the problems that you talked about. It's really difficult to get a 12-month-old child in, and parents struggle and things.
Yeah.
So there's, perhaps detriment is the wrong word, but it's harder, for
emotionally,
that to happen.
Yeah.
So do you think the legislation, given now that there's been quite a bit of flexibility built into 52 weeks, there's some financial support, do you think those conditions are leading people to delay the decision, but perhaps not aware of the difficulties that there are in actually trying to get a child into nursery education at a much later stage?
So I don't think anyone should shy away from the difficulties at 12 months or later.
Sure.
And I think that the legislation, if in an ideal world, I would love to see the legislation enabling parents to leave it a little bit longer if they can. And there wouldn't be a preference for a baby to go in at 6 months because it's easier.
Yes.
Than 12 months, because otherwise you've missed that window of opportunity around that good, secure bonding and attachment.
Yeah. My point is more about, do you think that the legislation is lending itself to support parental choice around delaying that entry into nursery education?
For those that can afford it, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And when you think of the conditions that perhaps somebody in the finance sector would be in employment, then that's a completely different kettle of fish to a family that perhaps we're working with. Yes. So for those families who might be able to afford it, yes, I think the legislation is. Yeah.
And do you think the legislation reflects the variation in the pattern of need, if you like? So, for example, you've just highlighted two different communities there, people working in the finance sector who might be more economically better off than maybe somebody who's reliant on income support. Do you think the legislation lends itself to help people make choice irrespective of whether they have that different economic position, or do you think it's more favourable to one group or the other?
I think up to 6 weeks where you've got your full pay, then the choice is there. You're able to remain at home with your baby. After 6 weeks, I think because of the low amount that's paid to a parent, the choice isn't there for all parents to be able to stay at home for a prolonged period of time.
And do you think the legislation reflects any impact that it may have on particular children in need with additional support requirements or anything like that? Do you think the legislation lends itself to supporting children with additional needs or disabilities?
Any differentiation at all for that?
Okay.
That's a good. What would you do with this law? Obviously, you have this understanding through the services that you provide of, you said, children who are living in poverty and have additional needs.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would do to this legislation in terms of improving it for those particular cohorts of children? You can think about that from everyone.
Well, if I had the time to dedicate to this, I think the first thing I'd be doing is looking at some of the Nordic countries and how they enable their 97% of their families remain at home until 2, and then at 2 almost 97% of them are in a group care setting. And they haven't got it all 100% right. There are good and not so great quality. We've heard from the OECD when they came to speak in Jersey years ago, the quality is varying across the board in those countries as well. But from a policy perspective, families are able and enabled to stay at home for the first 2 years of life, and then have options and provision available for them.
So would you say that's that's something that's aspirational, that being
That is.
able to stay at home with a
Yes.
child until they're 2 and then having the high quality provision. Is that something you think
I
we should
feel
aspire
that's
to?
aspirational based on the outcomes that those countries have got in terms of the difference that makes, but also having the options and the choices available. Because there will be some families, we have spoken to some families where, an entrepreneur mum that I can remember speaking to who said, gosh, I was back at work 6 days later, I couldn't leave, my business and things. And fair enough, they probably had a nanny around, or nannies around them. But there is a wealth of differences and needs from families, and I think that we need to think about how we can enable parents to have choice, real, genuine choice in how they can bring up their children and be a family.
So you'd like to see something in the law that takes into account different types of families and some flexibility there.
Can I follow up on that? I was just going to ask if you thought, as well as the kind of the legal side of that scenario, is there also a community and kind of, I suppose, reducing the stigmas or changing the culture side that would need to happen in order for that model to kind of work in somewhere like Jersey?
What sort of stigma do you mean about what?
The idea that people would stay at home for 2 years.
Oh, I see, and the perception of, I'll be paying for you to,
and also people, the stigma around maybe dads staying off work, but also what it might do to a woman's career, or I don't know, all sorts of different things. It seems, in personal opinion, it's a culture shift.
Yeah,
or something like that would be a culture
culture
shift for Jersey as well.
Absolutely, a huge culture shift. But I think we have had a culture shift, having had the changes to this legislation. I can speak from a personal experience of school pickups and the amount more dads that do school pickups, and I've seen that myself personally. I do think we're changing, and I think that this could influence culture in terms of how we think. And I think, another report which I was going to highlight to you, the Royal Foundation, Deloitte's produced this for the Royal Foundation, prioritising early childhood for a happier, healthier society, and that was exactly what they were saying as well. So that's another really helpful one, actually. Businesses have such a big role to play in this as well, and how, based on what the businesses are saying and doing, that will influence culture significantly.
Yes, just one thing. You mentioned earlier that choice again is an important thing, and people will make choices to bring their children into a nursery education setting.
Yeah.
Are there any people that choose not to do it, even though all of these benefits and entitlements are there? And do you know what that might be about at all?
Do you mean choose not to use any form of childcare
Yes.
and choose to stay at home with their child until they start school?
Yeah.
Yes, we've met families where they've chosen to do that. And actually, when the Nursery Education Fund was first introduced, I remember some very strong comments made to me at an information stand about it, saying, you can't force me to put my child into a setting. And absolutely, again, choice. Absolutely, it's there as a benefit for you if you would like it, but equally not. You don't. A bit like homeschooling and.
Do you think there's any gaps in the legislation to support families in that position at all?
Who would like to remain
family friendly? Who would like to remain at home?
I think from a financial perspective, there are some really creative things we could do around looking at where the government's money is going, so that could enable some families to have that option.
What would that look like in your view?
So could it be a benefit to a family that they actually, rather than the money going into the NEF pot, could that go to the family so that parents could use it to create opportunities for their children in different ways? Just kind of throwing things up a little bit and shaking it up and thinking, can we? The one thing, being a charity is, and also being a charity that's running a nursery in a government building, really high, and we work really closely with government, so we've got so much insight into this, is the agility and the flexibility and the creativeness that we can have as a charity, as long as we have enough money to be able to do it. meeting the needs of children that we see and hear about, and the lack of agility that you have in government because you have a very cumbersome, big, has to be run with very strict parameters, but that then obviously loses that agility and that creativity. Wouldn't it be lovely if we could have some thinking in government, some enabling to have that agility and that kind of, that we can change things up a little bit.
Could I just ask the final on that one, Jo? So you get a grant from government.
Yes.
How creative have you been,
With the grant?
taking forward some of your aspirations as to what it could be like? How creative have you been with the grant?
So the grant is, I can't remember how much percentage it is at the moment. Our total pot this year that we're going to be spending is 1.4 million. I think we have received 400,000 from government. So we have a service level agreement with government, and it is quite focused on certain projects and key performance indicators, beautifully written in partnership with us. So between the two of us, government and the Jersey Childcare Trust, we talk about what our impact will be, how we'll measure that impact, and government is agreeing that that's what they would like to receive in terms of key performance indicators. Again, we're raising £1 million. So the creativity comes from all that we're doing. Every programme that we run, we sit in each panel meeting and think we've nailed the referral form, and every single panel meeting we come away and we say, we've got to tweak that. That's not quite meeting the needs of what we need. And as a team, we can think differently about what we're doing very quickly and easily. And I don't think there's any restrictions on us from government. I've never experienced a restriction where government said, well, you can't do that. We've agreed this.
So you wouldn't use any of that grant to advance the family-friendly legislation, but it's more about the indirect benefit around your programmes that would lean itself to compliance with the family-friendly legislation.
So we comply as employers with the family-friendly legislation and beyond. What do you mean by the grant?
So when you receive so what I'm looking for is whether or not there is an approach that you take, whether the grant is almost an incentive for you to show and showcase the work that you do that is compliant with the family-friendly approach and means that the law is strengthened, if you like, through some of the things that you do, or whether or not you don't even think of the legislation, but you're more focused on your delivery as a charity in terms of.
So I think we do think about the legislation, and I think that we celebrate the fact we're an employer of choice, and we do our best to share key messages about how and why we're an employer of choice for our industry. Because when we opened Play and Learn, granted it was for term time, part-time places, but we didn't think we were going to be able to recruit to those 4 positions. And we had 24 expressions of interest. So we were bowled over by the response. And when we were speaking to candidates, we were hearing that we were offering something different. They liked us as an employer, that we prioritised families, genuinely prioritised families, that we had that flexibility of approach. So rather than we need you to work these hours, we were saying to the workforce, what would work for you and your family? And then we'll think how we can make that work with what we need. And so I feel that we're a really exemplary example of how you can be a family-friendly employer in an island, in an industry where there's a workforce crisis, where we have nurseries that have the space but don't have the workforce to work in it. And that's one of the reasons why they can't take as many children. So I think we do that already, but in our way.
Thank you.
Fiona, we've talked about the provision in the law. So we've established the 6 weeks
Yeah.
paid by the employer and the 32 weeks of social security, plus the grant.
Yeah.
But then there's up to 2 years, or it's one year per parent. So actually, for single parent families, it's 1 year, isn't it? Can you comment on that particular gap first of all? And I'll ask you about some other gaps, but single parents first of all, how are they impacted by this law?
That's something I've not thought about. You're absolutely right. I think that, we often talk about the juggle that parents have, and parents being plural, but if it is a single parent, then, they are restricted to 1 year. And when we think about everything that we were saying in the ISOS report, which talks about the one of the principles that this is founded on is the importance of the home environment. And so talking about what we were saying about that up to 2 year period can be really beneficial for the child. A single parent doesn't have that choice and that option.
What would you change in the law then to remedy that?
As a single parent, I would certainly say that you should be extending that to the 2 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Would you see any opportunity or have any thoughts around being able to share that with other people as a single parent, grandparents, for example?
One of the things that we notice, and going back to that person that broke down in the nursery, the grandparent, is that grandparents are also working. And so, yes, I mean, if there was that opportunity, I think the impact, you need to think about the impact around employers as well. But if you had an extended family member that was able to take that, that could be a really good way forward.
Yeah, this is what I was going to ask about the gap. So even if somebody, the parents could afford to care for their children at home for 2 years or a year each, there will be people that, as we've reflected on, that can't afford to do that. There's a gap, isn't there? So even if you can take the full 2 years and then the nursery funding starts at 3, what happens in that gap? What are families doing in that gap?
I don't know. I mean, we're obviously supporting about 10% of the 2 to 3 year old cohort with that gap.
Yeah.
But I don't know. And it sort of stems back to the question where I answered you at the start and I said, I don't know because parents haven't told us.
Yeah.
We can ask parents what they think about certain things, but there's going to be a group of parents that we won't be able to reach and we won't be able to hear from. And I think it's focusing on how we can hear from them. And I think using charities is one really good way of doing that.
Yeah. So collecting more data, you think, would help us to understand?
To hear from parents. Yeah.
And in terms of that gap again, if parents aren't able to afford childcare but they can't stay off work, are you aware of unregistered childcare being an issue?
So I know that Childcare and Early Years Service hear reports and they will go and investigate. We don't, at the trust, rarely will hear, and if we do, then obviously straight away we would refer it to Childcare and Early Years Service.
Yeah.
Sometimes we'll have people innocently calling about, making inquiries around if they would like to become a childminder, for example, or a nanny, and there's a real lack of understanding sometimes about which is what role and who cares for who where in their own home or in the child's home. And so we can have people who won't realise that they're in a slightly wonky situation, so we'll give them information and say you need to be based in the child's home, or your home needs to be registered under the requirements of the Daycare of Jersey law. So usually that's just a case of lack of information. And
Are you ever concerned about things that you hear?
The cases that we've had, no, but I know that Childcare and Early Years Service would be involved.
Could I just ask you, of the number of families that you engage with, what sort of proportion of families sort of disengage from nursery support? Do you have them for that whole 2-3 year period, or are there periods where families say, I just can't afford this anymore, or I can't sustain, being in work, and therefore I'm going to look after my child at home? Do you ever have any stories like that at all?
So our our nursery funding programme does have stories where referrals will come in from somebody who they had been funding a portion of nursery each week, and it was completely unaffordable. They were going into debt. We usually have one or two for a panel that would be in those circumstances.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot to come up to the surface and to do that. So usually they're identified by health visitors in a 2-year check, which is a universal offer for all children, which is how we get our referrals for that programme.
Yeah.
But it's...
What would you say the dropout rate is?
I have no idea.
No.
Again, that's a Jersey Early Years Association one.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And they may well not know the reasons why somebody's left the nursery, because it's a really personal thing, isn't it, to declare that things aren't going great.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Good. In terms of the legislation, if you obviously you've already given some suggestions and ideas, just looking at that, the 2020 legislation there, is there anything that you think could be further improved on that list, or anything that isn't there at all that you would add in to that legislation to improve it?
I don't know. Beyond what we've spoken about. Don't know. No.
I wanted to reflect on something that you said about encouraging the dads to take the leave and that culture change, which I think you mentioned. So in some countries, although the way that our law is drafted, it's completely equal. So parent 1 and parent 2, they have the equal right to the 52 weeks.
Yeah.
In some countries, you can share portions of the leave, but then often the fathers end up taking less leave.
Yeah.
What comment can you make on whether you'd recommend that or not?
I think from an employer perspective, it doesn't appear fair. If you're an employer of mainly females, for example, it just doesn't sit quite squarely. If you have that equal year opportunity to take each, you've got that key message going out to both parents that you are equally entitled to, because you are equally parents. I think if you start moving it to one carer, it changes the shift and then changes that cultural shift that you'd be hoping for more of.
So that might be kind of a backwards move if that was...
The bit from the business world that I've picked up as well, on LinkedIn as well, is the number of father parents who have posted about their experiences of positiveness of their employers, usually the finance sector actually, but have made those comments and how they've celebrated being parents and being able to be parents and how their employers enabled that to happen.
That's really good to hear. That's really positive, and that's certainly what we've heard when we've done our pop-up sessions at baby groups. We've spoken to some dads, and gratitude was expressed. I think for that change. I think people are it's still sinking in, isn't it, to some families that actually that dads are just as important, aren't they? I had another question that's gone out of my head. Do you have any final ones that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I'd just like to. Do you have any view of whether there are any sectors that don't or that choose not to access nursery education at all?
Any sectors of, you mean employees that work in a sector that choose not to access education?
You wouldn't have that intelligence available to you.
Well, I suppose a theme that comes through from our families that are referred to us for the nursery funding programme, so living in poverty, that would be there are a number of carers that have come through, a number of new to Jersey, so people that have come in on visas from Kenya, for example, that have been referred to us, working in the care industry. Yeah, so, but I suppose what they all have in common is the lower earning,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
matter which.
So that goes hand in hand really with the choice that if they need your support,
Yeah,
it's generally because they're on a lower income.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you mentioned a few times maybe health visitors, 2-year checks,
Yes.
that kind of thing. Family nursing and home care
Yeah.
are one of your partners who you work
Very
with,
much
aren't they?
so.
How do you, can you just tell us a little bit about how you work with
Yeah.
these? And
So-
we are going to be speaking to them in another
Super.
hearing as well.
I suppose there's all sorts of tentacles into different ways we work with them, but essentially I describe family nursing as our eyes and ears. In the island, it's a crucial service where they offer that universal health care to every baby up to the age of 5, and from pre-birth as well. And yeah, I mean, we're co-located with a team of them at Pip's Place, obviously, so they have the lower floor, and they offer weaning workshops and stay and play sessions and things. And invariably, we're sharing the same families who will access their services initially and then come on to ours for their nursery funding. We're also co-located with Mind Jersey, who again support families, particularly mums, who may be struggling with their mental health. And there's a real theme running through the families who are living in poverty. The children have developmental delays of poor mental health as well. And so actually in terms of partnership working, there's a number of different charities that we work with and departments that support families in different ways with us.
Those families that struggle with mental health, is there anything you think that the law could do to better support those families in particular?
Well, I think having that real choice to be able to be a family for a longer period of time than 6 weeks, paid fully, to reduce that financial stress and pressure on parents so they have a real opportunity to stay off work with their children, for time to recover for themselves, having given birth, but then also to become parents and a family, to hopefully breastfeed if that's their choice, but just totally adjust and to,
It's that choice,
Yeah,
isn't it, again,
yeah.
that you keep coming back to. And if we were to achieve that true choice, what impact would that have on the children of Jersey?
It would impact whole society, and we would have happier, healthier children, and we would have happier and healthier eventual adults. And it would transform, I think, some of the ways that we fund certain services. I think it would shift how and what we fund, and it would change things.
If you were to point to an ideal model in a country that you respect and consider maybe Jersey's legislation could aspire to something like that, where would you choose?
I'd look to the Nordic countries, definitely. And I haven't had time to kind of say whether it would be Denmark or Sweden, but the Nordic countries have certainly got the model that makes the most sense in terms of brain development and everything we know about what children and families need, and then eventually the community, because we all want happier, healthier adults at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have a final question?
Not for me.
Okay, is there anything that you'd like to add or add more detail to before we close the hearing?
The one stat that I normally start off with, which I didn't, and I think it's really important to kind of base everything of what we do and why we do it, is that 80% of your brain is developed by 3. And that if we just took language development for a minute, that peaks at 9 months old. So when we're talking about, we were saying babies going to nursery at 12 months old, well, your language development's peaked by 9 months. So as long as you are living in a good home learning environment, you're going to have a really good start, certainly for your language development, for example, and that we really should keep in mind that those first 3 years and the experiences that we have really amount to what you have as an adult in terms of your well-being.
Thank you very much for
Pleasure.
answering all of our questions today, and thank you for your time. Close the hearing now.
Thank you.
Yeah.